Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, it's often been said that an army marches on its stomach. I've seen that quote or a variation of it attributed to Napoleon Bonaparte, to Frederick the Great, to others. And while they may or may not have said those things, they certainly understood them. Some of the great generals throughout history have been great generals not only because of their strategic and tactical abilities, but because of their ability to effectively supply their armies. That can often be the difference between winning and losing, not only in battles, but in wars. So we're going to go back to tasting history today, and we're going to take a look at one of his most popular videos, which is Hardtack and Hellfire Stew. Hardtack is kind of the iconic staple food item of especially the Union armies during the American Civil War, but Southern as well. It was kind of this hard cracker thing that was not only nutritious, but it lasted, even though it would get worms and things on it sometimes. And it could be easily carried. It was light. It was effective. It wasn't particularly tasty. And so the men would come up with different ways to prepare it. And I'm sure we'll get into all of that. But I thought this one might be an interesting one to look into because feeding an army has been a make or break thing when it comes to history, and so much of history has been determined by people's ability to feed their armies. So the link is in the description. You can check this out without my commentary or check out any of his other videos. This is my second time doing a reaction to tasting history, so I hope you enjoy it. Let's go ahead and dive in.
Question: what the heck do you do with hardtack? Because biting into it ain't in the cards. Well, during the American Civil War, they'd make Hellfire Stew. A big thank you to Wondrium for sponsoring this video as I test the strength of my teeth and my stomach with Hellfire Stew from the American Civil War. This time on Tasting History. So one of the main ingredients in Hellfire Stew is hardtack. And as it happens, last year I made some hardtack and I still have quite a bit left over, so that's what I'm going to be using. Now this is actually called a ship's biscuit. They are one...
Now notice what he said. He said, last year I made some hardtack and I have some left over and that's what I'm going to be using. So that shows you the lasting power of this stuff, and that's why it was so important. It did have... Basically, what is your point in feeding your army? It's not to necessarily give them a delicious 5-course meal every day. It's to make sure that they have the nutrition they need to be able to stay healthy and stay in fighting shape. And the quickest and easiest way to do that is to give them something that they can carry with them that won't go bad and can basically meet the needs of the army. And when you get opportunities, then you supplement that. And that's why often the soldiers would pick apples off of trees, or if they found themselves in enemy territory and there was some cattle available on a farm that they stopped to camp at, well, you know how that ends up.
One and the same, hardtack was a term that was used later during the American Civil War. There are differences between this version and what would have been used in the Civil War. This one is based off of what would have been made in the British Navy in the 19th century, and there are...
Yeah, and he makes a good point. You saw an image earlier of the Civil War, American Civil War hardtack, which basically looks like a big cracker, like a big saltine cracker.
Are a few differences. First of all, the shape.
There you go.
This was meant to be kept in barrels, whereas Civil War hardtack was meant to be kept in boxes, so it was square to make it easier to ship. Then there's also the size, mostly in how thick it is, because these tended to be 4 to a pound, these tended to be between 8 and 10 to a pound. Then the last difference is all whole wheat, not as much whole wheat, and that's about it. Essentially, they're the same though, especially for our purposes. So I'm going to use a little bit of both. But I'm guessing that the year-old hardtack will actually taste better because, like a fine wine, hardtack gets better with age, or if not gets better, then at least develops in taste on account of the worms.
The worms, there you go. Yeah, and there's protein there to be had, right? And you got to figure in the American Civil War, this hardtack's not going to be a year old because it's being shipped to the front as quickly as they can make it and get it to the armies.
I have often seen hundreds, nay thousands, shaken out of a single biscuit. We in the cabin have, however, an easy remedy for this, by baking it in an oven not too hot, which makes them all walk off. But this cannot be allowed to the ship's people, who must find the taste of these animals very disagreeable, as they every one taste as strong as mustard. Sadly, no worms found their way into my hardtack, so I will just have to pretend. Now today's recipe comes from the diary of William Bircher, who was a drummer boy in the 2nd Regiment Minnesota Veterans Volunteers. When, as was generally the case on...
Now, just for clarification purposes, when you hear that 2nd Minnesota Veteran Volunteers, that's actually a very specific designation that tells us something about that unit. Because typically you'll see the 2nd Minnesota Volunteer Infantry. So states raised units, and then they were given over to federal service. So while they have state designations like volunteer infantry, that means these were volunteers. Whereas if you were to say 2nd Minnesota Infantry, but it doesn't have that word volunteer in it, that might imply that this is a drafted unit, but the 2nd wouldn't have been. These are later in the war if you're dealing with drafted units, and a lot of time draftees would be brought into supplement ranks. But that designation, veteran volunteers, most of the Union regiments, at least once you got into the war fully, were signed up for 3 years. And so by early 1864, a lot of these 3-year units are in the final months of their enlistment. I'll give you an example. The 20th Ohio Infantry, it's the one I'm writing a book about. They all signed up in September and October of 1861, which meant that in October of 64, their enlistments were up. Well, in like January, they start doing a re-enlistment drive. And if you got a certain percentage of your men in your unit to re-enlist for the duration of the war, typically, then you would get the designation veteran volunteers. Any man who re-enlisted got to go home for a furlough, usually 30 or 60 days, and then they would come back to fight. And so if they're veteran volunteers, that means they had a lot of their men who were still with the unit for 3 years that re-enlisted for additional service.
In March, our hardtack was broken into small pieces in our haversacks. We soaked these in water and fried them in pork fat, stirring well and seasoning with salt and pepper, thus making what was commonly called a hell-fired stew.
You know, that honestly doesn't sound that bad. I mean, as far as being out and making the best of a situation. So I'm curious to see how this looks and how it tastes.
Pretty darn simple, as is most of the food that they were eating, but we will go into that later. But for this recipe, what you'll need is some pork grease. Now they would have had several options for pork fat. First and most common was salt pork, but sometimes they did get cured bacon, so that's what I'm going to be using. 1, because it's going to taste better, and 2, because then you don't have to get rid of all the salt. A bit of salt, and a bit of pepper, and of course hardtack, which is just flour, water, sometimes a little bit of salt, that is baked until it's rock hard. Yep. And like I said, I did this a year ago and I made a video on it, so if you want to learn how to make the hardtack, I will put a link to that in the description. So you're not looking to bust this up into flour per se, but you want it fairly fine, maybe a few larger pieces, but you want it pretty fine so it will thicken. Best thing to do is to stick it in a bag and hit it a few times with whatever blunt instrument you have on hand. Okay, so they both took some pounding to bust up, but the year-old ship's biscuit was a heck of a lot harder, and I don't know if it's because of the age or because it is thicker, but that took a lot of work. It's kind of crazy how hard this stuff is, but not for long, because you're going to put it into a bowl and pour some water over it, and in just a couple minutes it'll soak it up and be soft-er.
It looks almost like cereal in that situation.
Now, the soldiers ate this hardtack so much that they quickly got sick and tired of it. And one of the ways that they would vent their frustration was to write parody lyrics to other popular songs about how much they hated hardtack.
This makes sense. I mean, you have to do anything you can to cope with a situation, and whether it's finding creative ways to eat the stuff. I mean, if you're eating the same thing over and over and over again, great example of this, if you've ever seen the movie The Martian, with Matt Damon, which is a fantastic movie, I think, by the way. All he had for a while was potatoes, and so he's like doing different things to try and make it a little more interesting with potatoes, and then he runs out of ketchup, and then he starts dipping it in Vicodin and weird things like that.
One was the Stephen Foster song Hard Times. Let us close our game of poker, take our tin cups in our hand, while we gather round the cook's tent door, where dry mummies of hardtack are given to each man. Oh, hardtack, come again no more. 'Tis the song of the soldier, weary, hungry, and faint. Hardtack, hardtack, come again no more. And the author
Nice.
of our recipe, the drummer boy, lamented, "Our hardtack were very hard. We could scarcely break them with our teeth. Some we could scarcely fracture with our fist."
And you have to think, too, that because they're not getting enough of things like vitamin C, you're going to deal with like scurvy, where your gums are going to get weak, and biting into some of this hardtack could cause you to like actually lose teeth, I could imagine.
Said that it did furnish quite a bit of nourishment once they could figure out how to get to it by doing things like making hellfire stew. Thus we saw what truly vast and unsuspected possibilities resided in this innocent-looking 3.5-inch square hardtack. 3 made a meal and 9 were a ration, and this was what fought the battles for the Union.
Yeah, I love these quotes that he's using, because it's a great way to understand this by actually hearing the words of the men who experienced this stuff firsthand.
Pretty good endorsement as long as it is edible. And to do that, it's going to take some pig grease. So heat up your grease and then add the soaked hardtack into the pan, sprinkle a little salt and pepper on it, and stir it around until it browns. It only should take a couple minutes, which is plenty of time to hit the like button, make sure you're subscribed to Tasting History, and listen to me talk to you about what else a Civil War soldier might eat.
So while we're at this break, this is a great time to tell you, you may have heard me talk about the fact that I've got a channel now called Stories of the Great War, where I'm putting all of my original content associated with World War I. Not only anything new that I'm filming, like in 2 weeks when I go back to the Western Front, I'm going to be going to the Somme, to Vimy Ridge, and to Ypres. And all of the videos I shoot from that visit will all go up on Stories of the Great War. And with that in mind, I'm now doing the same with all of my original Civil War content. It's called Stories of the Civil War. Links down in the description. Kind of doing a soft launch of it right now. Uploading some of my previous content that I've filmed and put on this channel. It'll go up on Stories of the Civil War. Seems to be doing really well doing it that way on Stories of the Great War, so I'm going to do the same thing. And some new original content coming there as well. My visit to Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie. My visit to the H.L. Hunley, the Confederate submarine, and telling that story. That's all going to be going up on Stories of the Civil War in the next couple of weeks. So check that out, link in the description. All right, back to it. Time for history.
Now, any talk of what a Civil War soldier might eat comes with a whole barrel of caveats. Were you an officer? Were you Union or Confederate? Where in the country were you fighting?
Yeah.
What time of year was it? And how far into the war was it? And of course, were you wounded or captured? Last year I did a video on what you might eat in a Union hospital, and frankly, it was not too bad food compared to what everybody else was getting. On the other end of the spectrum, if you were in Andersonville, you'd be lucky to be getting anything.
So, did a video at Andersonville several years ago. It's still here on the channel. That'll go up onto the new channel. But terrible place. It was a place that was designed for, I don't know, 5,000 to 10,000 prisoners, and they were putting 30,000 to 40,000 in there. And the Confederates couldn't even feed their own soldiers well enough, let alone a bunch of Union prisoners that they were accumulating in 1864.
So with that in mind, I'm going to be focusing on what your average Union soldier would get if they got what was due to them. In his memoir aptly named Hardtack and Coffee, John Billings of the Army of the Potomac claimed that they rarely went without any kind of rations. They were pretty well fed. As to the quality of those rations, that was a little bit more variable. So much so that when they got salt beef, they questioned where it actually came from and would call it salt horse.
More often than not, if they were in, like, say, winter camp, where there was no fighting expected for a couple of months, they would probably eat better. But if you were going on a march and you were pursuing the enemy, they might give you 3 days of rations, and that was typically just going to be hardtack. And even General Grant, during the Vicksburg campaign, when they broke away from their supply chain for a while, when they first crossed the Mississippi south of Vicksburg at Bruinsburg and started their march up toward Vicksburg, toward Jackson and then Vicksburg, he even said that he went days without eating anything but hardtack.
He goes so far as to claim that the food inspectors of the Army were actually in cahoots and taking bribes from the contractors who were giving them the poor quality rations.
It was happening.
And no language can be too strong to express the contempt every patriotic man, woman, and child must feel for such small-souled creatures, many of whom are today rolling in the riches acquired in this way. But provided everything was on the up and up, the soldier in camp should expect to get some variation of salt pork, fresh beef, salt beef, rarely ham or bacon, hard bread, soft bread, potatoes, an occasional onion, flour, beans, split peas, rice, dried apples, dried peaches, desiccated vegetables, coffee, tea, sugar, molasses, vinegar, candles, soap, pepper, and salt. Mind you, they didn't get all of that every day. It was always some variation, kind of came piecemeal, and that was only if they were encamped. If they were marching, they got 1 pound of hard bread, 3/4 of a pound of salt pork, or 1 1/4 pounds of fresh meat, sugar, coffee, and salt.
And so you had to carry all of that with you, along with your canteen and all your equipment and your ammunition, your bedding supplies, your personal items, all of it.
Important that when you were in camp, you saved a little bit of that ration back for those days that you were out marching. And there are a few reasons why those two rations were so different. First was that the supply train was often well behind the majority of the marching army. Another was that while they often brought herds of cows with them, they needed to set up camp in order to slaughter and butcher them for meat. Now, to break down some of these rations and discuss what the men made of them, we should start with the staple, hardtack. According to John Billings, there were actually 3 kinds. The first was the kind that was so hard that you really couldn't eat it. This was the best kind. The drummer boy who wrote our recipe claims that the hardness came from its age. For there was a common belief among the boys that our hardtack had been baked long before the beginning of the Christian era. This opinion was based on the fact that the letters BC were stamped on the cracker boxes.
So again, this is a situation where if you are facing difficult conditions, you're facing death on a daily basis, not only from the enemy, but from disease in camp, you're going to find anything to make it a little lighthearted and to laugh about your circumstances. Totally get that.
BC likely stood for Brigade Commissary or else the company that provided them. The other 2 types of hardtack were soggy and moldy, usually because of bad storage, and ones infested with worms, maggots, and weevils. And if a man got either of these types, they were supposed to be able to take them back and swap them out for some good hardtack, provided there was any good hardtack left, and provided that they knew that it was bad, because in the dark, it could be hard to tell.
And they were not only dealing with their food being infested this way, but themselves. They would get lice and they would get, like different critters that were crawling over. Imagine when you're sitting around a campfire for a couple hours and you got to deal with the mosquitoes. Imagine living outside for months on end.
And it was no uncommon occurrence for a man to find the surface of his pot of coffee swimming with weevils after breaking up hardtack into it, which had come out.
I can't help but think of the joke that the captain tells in the movie Master and Commander, where he talks about the lesser of 2 weevils.
Out of the fragments, only to drown. Though he says that once skimmed off, they left no discernible taste. But even if you had the best kind of hardtack, you had to do something to it to make it edible. And the drummer boy says that there were 15 distinct ways of doing this. One, of course, was our stew today, the Hellfire Stew. Another was called skilly-gally, and they're actually very, very similar, though it was described as a dish to make the hair curl, and certainly was indigestible enough to satisfy the cravings of the most ambitious dyspeptic. Another dish was lobscouse, which was basically like a stew, depending on what you had laying around, that was then thickened with the hardtack. And it actually,
what's crazy is they would even, necessity is the mother of invention. We say that all the time. When you need something, you find a way to get it. And I don't mean like if I need an apple, I can get an apple. But if you need food, you find a ways to get creative with it. And these guys would also come up with these crazy recipes for alcohol that they would make. And you would look at some of the ingredients and it was crazy. Some of the food they would make and some of the drinks even they would make with like tree bark. It was crazy. But you do what you have to survive.
Actually doesn't sound that bad, according to John Townsend, who made it on his wonderful show Townsend's, and seemed to like it. But as palatable as lobscouse sounds, there's another concoction that sounds a little bit less so, and that was if you were out marching and didn't have time to make a fire, but were really, really hungry and willing to risk your teeth, then they would eat hardtack in the raw state. In order, however, to make them somewhat more palatable, a thin slice of nice fat pork was cut down and laid on the cracker, and a spoonful of good brown sugar put on top of the pork, and we had a dish fit for a soldier. Of course, the pork was raw and had just come out of the pickle. Sugar, yay.
That sounds good.
Raw salted pork, nay. Now, if they didn't want to eat it like that, or if they didn't want to soften it by mixing it up with some grease or some coffee. Then they pounded them to a powder, mixed this with boiled rice, and made griddle cakes and honey, minus the honey. But perhaps the most impressive dish that they would make with hardtack was called hardtack pudding. And they would pound it until it did become a flour, and then they would mix that with a little bit of wheat flour and water, and made a stiff dough, which we next rolled out on a cracker box lid like a pie crust. Then we covered this all over with a preparation of stewed dried apples, dropping in here and there a raisin or two, just for auld lang syne's sake.
Guys are creative. When you have to be, you will come up with ways to make it palatable.
Then they'd wrap this in a cloth and boil it like any other pudding, and it would be served with wine sauce, though the wine was usually omitted and hunger inserted in its stead. Now, as versatile as hardtack was, they did have other options. One was a small, round, white bean that they simply called the army bean. And while the drummer boy admits that it's not as versatile as the hardtack, the one great dish which might be made of it was so preeminently excellent that it threw hellfire stew and hardtack pudding quick into the shade. That dish was baked beans, and I have to admit, baked beans is one of my favorite foods, though today it usually does have sugar in it, and the way that they made it was simply with beans, water, pork fat that was left to slowly simmer in a pot overnight on hot coals. Now, if you were set up in camp for a little while and the supply lines were running as they ought to be, then the food did get quite a bit better. First of all, you had access to that fresh meat and to a lot of fresh bread. When encamped, they would build ovens, and a lot of them. When the army was encamped outside of Petersburg, Virginia,
So I need to point out here that this picture is commonly attributed to Petersburg. And in fact, you'll often see it even in books saying it's in Petersburg. But as my friend Gary Edelman, who is part of an institute for Civil War photography, will point out to you, this picture was not taken in Petersburg. It's taken outside of Fredericksburg, I believe in the spring of 1863 during the Chancellorsville campaign.
Grant ordered the civilian bakers at City Point to tend those ovens, and they would bake 123,000 loaves of bread every single day. Now, all of these rations, whether it's the hardtack, the pork, the beans, or the coffee, everything came in really large quantities, usually.
And all of this, when you start thinking about the massive amount of supplies, just food alone, that it takes to feed an army of, say, 80,000 men in the field, you start to realize why things happen the way that they do and where they happen. So, for example, why is the Union Army often taking the same routes that it's taking toward Richmond, going places like Fredericksburg, Manassas, then Fredericksburg, down through like Cold Harbor in that area? Because they had to stay close to their supply lines, whether it was by rail or by sea, by river. You had to have a way to quickly supply your army. And the further you got away from supply lines, the further you got away from home, the more strung out those supply lines became and the more difficult it became. And this is one of the understated things about General Grant that made him such a great general. He had been a quartermaster back in the Mexican War, so he understood logistics and supplies better than most.
Meant for 100 or more men in big sacks and big boxes. These would then be given to the orderly sergeant for a company who was in charge of doling them out evenly to the men.
And so there was a position called commissary sergeant, who was a guy who was often in charge of that. And one of the men who was a commissary sergeant was the 23rd Ohio's William McKinley. We did a video about him from Antietam.
And it seemed the most popular way to do this was to lay out a big blanket and then put all of the rations in little piles for each man. And to prevent any charge of unfairness or injustice, the sergeant would turn his back on the rations and take out his roll of the company. Then someone else would point to a pile and ask, "Who shall have this?" And the sergeant, without turning, would call a name from his list. William Bircher, our drummer boy, gives a kind of a sad account of how this process changed throughout the course of the war. At the beginning, it took quite a long time because they had 100 men in the company and they had a lot of rations coming in. But after we had been in the field a year or two, the call, "Fall in for your hardtack," was leisurely responded to by only about a dozen men. Lean, sinewy, hungry-looking fellows each with his haversack in hand.
And yeah, and that wasn't necessarily because all the others had died. It was because they might be sick, they might have been sent home for disability, they might have been wounded, they might have been killed, they might have been captured. There are some instances where entire companies ceased to exist. At Gettysburg, the 26th North Carolina had entire companies that just no longer existed. The 1st Texas at Antietam, same thing. 1st Minnesota at Gettysburg.
So there is so much more information on this topic that I could cover. I'm not going to, because this video I think is already getting quite long, but I am going to cover specifically coffee, Civil War coffee, in an upcoming drinking history video, so be on the lookout for that. But for now, it's time to try our Hellfire Stew. So once it's well browned, just take it off the fire and serve it up. And here we are, Hellfire Stew from the American Civil War.
At all.
Not gonna lie, looks like dog food. Premium dog food, but dog food.
I don't think it looks bad.
Smells pretty good though. It smells like bacon grease. Let's give it a chance. That's really weird.
I bet it's tolerable. Kind of like it.
The texture is really weird.
He likes it. He's surprised that he likes it.
It's going to get stuck in every crevice of your mouth. It actually, the flavor is not that bad. It kind of reminds me of chorizo, but really much drier and crumblier. If you add even more fat, it might adhere a little bit better, but even then, I think it's going to be crumbly no matter what.
Yeah.
I use quite a bit of fat in this. The thing is, the hardtack soaks up everything. It needs liquid, so water, grease, just add more. But overall, it's not that bad, and if I was really, really hungry and hadn't eaten that much and had just gone on a 20-mile march, I'd gladly eat this. So make sure to follow me on Instagram, Tasting History with Max Miller, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.
That was good. I really enjoyed that. So definitely check out his channel. The link's down in the description to this video, but you can check out all the other ones as well. I think it's a fascinating lens through which to view history, is through the lens of food. It's one of the many lenses we can use to get a different angle of history and why things happened the way that they did and how they operated. Please check out the new channel, Stories of the Civil War. Links down in the description. Not much content on there yet. I'll make a couple of videos live today, but those will be videos you may have previously seen on this channel, but new original content is coming soon. Thanks for watching.